Picoult is the best-selling author of 24 books with over 14 million copies in print worldwide. Currently, Jodi is working on a Broadway musical with her daughter, Samantha Van Leer. 5 of her books have been adapted for film or television, and her latest, Small Great Things, already has Julia Roberts and Viola Davis on board for its film adaptation. In this interview, Jodi and I are going to be having a frank and enlightening conversation about creativity, the act of making mistakes and learning from revision, and how racial bias is woven into what we do in and out of the classroom. Welcome, Jodi. So the first part I want to dive into is the piece as a writer.
Yeah.
And so, as you know, we focus on arts integration across content areas for reading and math and science and social studies, how to teach those things in and through the
Love
arts.
it. Mhm.
Writing is truly an art form of its own, right? So, how do you work through that creative process and find the balance between the art and the science of writing?
I think that you have to keep in mind I used to be an educator. Before I
Awesome.
was a teacher, a writer, I was a teacher. I taught 8th grade English at a
Wow.
public school in Concord, Mass.
Yeah.
And so I get asked a lot, how can I instill a love of writing in the kids that I work with? And I think what's really important to recognize is that there is a difference between teaching kids the tools to write, particularly an analytical essay, and
Mhm.
teaching kids a love of writing. Those
Yes.
are two very different things. And
Yes.
so, just as if you're trying to teach a kid to love to read, you don't force them to read Moby Dick. You let them read a book of baseball statistics or manga or, comic books, fiction, anything that strikes their fancy.
Mhm.
So that they fall in love with the act of reading. So that then, when you make them suffer through Moby Dick, they still have this sense of why they loved picking up a book in the first place. And I believe that writing is a lot like that as well. So I think that when you start to teach writing and to engage kids with writing, you try to do it in a way that allows them to explore many different forms. Because a kid who is a great analytical essay writer may be a very poor poet,
Right.
but a kid who is a poet, may never get an analytical essay.
The idea of crossing artistic mediums is also, I think, something that a lot of people struggle with. We talk a lot about integrating art with writing or with math or music
Right.
with math, but to do writing with art or writing with music and having them cross those content areas, it's like a whole new spark comes up that you
Totally
didn't
is.
know.
And again, I think it's really important because there are kids who will excel
Mhm.
in one area who suddenly become much more interested in, say, the English component of it because you have incorporated music, which they love and might be very gifted at.
Yeah.
Um, the idea that there are many ways to tell a story is
Mhm.
critical when it comes to education. I would argue for, thinking about that. How do you how do you tell a story when, for example, your main character lies to your audience?
Mm.
How do you tell a story if your main character is mute? Try to create situations for yourself where you have to incorporate a different medium. When I wrote a book called The 10th Circle, I walked into my publisher and I said, so this is going to have a graphic novel in the middle of it because the main
Mm.
character can't tell you what he's feeling, but he can show you. And to their credit, my publisher looked at me and said, okay. And then published it. And I had found a graphic novelist who was able to take the graphic novel I wrote and
Mhm.
bring it to life within the pages of the story. And I love that. I loved being able to push that boundary. When I wrote Sing You Home, which is the story of a woman who is gay and who is facing issues with reproductive rights, basically, and what to do with a frozen embryo.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things I really wanted to look at was gay rights in this country and how sometimes the people who are the most opposed to gay rights are the people who don't know anyone gay or think they don't know anyone gay. And
Wow.
I wanted the reader to actually hear this woman's voice, this woman's pain, this woman's thoughts. And so I partnered with my best friend who happens to be a songwriter,
Mhm.
and we together wrote 10 songs that were, again, woven throughout the narrative, so that the reading experience wasn't just about reading text, it was also about taking in the voice of this character and this music.
Oh, that's so stunning. But it also leads me as a nice segue into talking about your latest book, Small Great Things.
Mhm.
So I'm going to go ahead and admit that this book made me feel really uncomfortable as a white woman
Yeah, it
in
should.
America,
Great.
which I know is what
Yeah,
you wanted the reader to experience. So
yeah.
good job.
Thank you. Thank you.
But there is a huge foundation in this book about racial bias.
Correct.
You tell us more about that and what you hope that we can learn from this book, whether the people in our audience today can have
Mhm.
read it already or if they haven't. Just go ahead and let us
Right.
know more about that and what you hope we can learn from this book.
So, unconscious bias is the idea that there's racism all around us. It's basically in the air we breathe. And even if we ourselves do not have personal moments of racism, even if we would say, oh, I'm not a racist, you can't help the fact that the society we live in is biased toward white people. How do you see it? In all the little details. Go to CVS, go to the pharmacy, go find a flesh colored bandage.
Yeah.
Does it match your flesh or does it match the flesh of someone with darker skin? Go find a greeting card that has people of color on the front of it. I dare you. It's really hard. The standard of beauty in America is a white standard of beauty. And these are the things that I'm talking about when I talk about unconscious bias. It's not our fault. It's all around us. And because we keep ingesting it, we are going to unconsciously be biased towards a white society, the idea that whites make up society, that their narrative, that their story is the one that's important. Now,
Mhm.
of course, this is BS. If you want to challenge me on this, Harvard actually has a terrific implicit bias um, test that you can do right on your keyboard. If
Mhm.
you Google Harvard implicit bias, it'll come up. And you'll be sitting there thinking, I'm totally above this. I am going to show how incredibly equitable I am and that I am not a racist. And trust me, you will come out on that test as showing implicit bias. It's a great tool to sort of checking yourself a little bit. So, the point of me writing this book as a white woman was racism is something that I had wanted to write about for a long time, and I really didn't know how to do it. In fact, I started a book and I failed miserably, and I shelved the book because I couldn't create, real narratives and stories and voices of people of color. And I really questioned myself. Did I have the right to do that? Cultural appropriation is a very real thing. Was I trying to profit off somebody else's oppression? Why did I want to write that story so badly? And it wasn't until I came across this story in 2012 that actually happened in Flint, Michigan, where an African American nurse with 20 years of experience in a labor and delivery ward helped deliver this baby. And in the aftermath, the baby's father called in her supervisors and said, I don't want her or anyone who looks like her touching my child. And he pushed up his sleeve to reveal a swastika tattoo. He was a white supremacist, a neo Nazi. The hospital wound up putting a post-it note in the baby's file saying no African American personnel to touch this infant. The nurse and several other colleagues banded together. They sued. They settled out of court. I hope she got lots and lots of money. But it made me wonder, what if something had changed? What if that nurse was the only one alone with that child when something went wrong? What if she had to choose between violating her supervisor's orders or saving a baby's life? What if she wound up on trial as a result of that? What if I could tell the story from the points of view of the white public defender who defends her, who, like me, like you, would never say she's a racist,
Mhm.
of the white supremacist dad, and of this woman, the African American nurse herself? What if I could tell all of their stories as they began to examine their beliefs about race and power and privilege? And suddenly I knew that I was going to be able to finish this because I wasn't writing a book to tell people of color what their lives are like. That's not my job.
Mhm.
That is not my right. There are plenty of African American authors doing a really good job of it without me.
Right.
My job was to talk to people who look like you, people who look like me, people who can very easily point to a white supremacist and say, oh, that's a racist, but can't do this and say the same thing.
Right.
And you are supposed to feel uncomfortable reading the book. You are supposed to understand that we as white people often don't talk about racism because we're terrified of saying the wrong thing.
Mm,
And it is so fraught with minefields, the discussion of racism, that we would rather not talk about it at all. Now,
yep.
to a person of color, what does that look like? It looks like you don't even care enough to start a conversation. So we're on two different sides of a canyon here.
Yep.
And what I wanted to point out was that it's more important to talk about racism, to make mistakes, to say, I'm so sorry, I learned from that, thank you, and move forward, than to not talk about it at all.
Mhm.
I wanted to bring up the point that racism is systemic and institutional and unwieldy and massive. But systems and institutions are made up of people.
Yeah.
And if you start to change one mind at a time, you can steer a system or an institution in a different way. And that's really how we begin to change. Racism is not the problem of people of color. They're the ones affected by it. Racism is the problem of white people to solve because we're the ones perpetrating it.
Right.
And that's really what I wanted people to look at. The social justice definition of a racist is someone who has both prejudice and power. And that's why if you are white in America, you have all the power. That's the reality.
Mhm.
So you do have an element of racism in terms of responsibility. You are responsible for some of what's happening there.
Yeah.
I like to think about it like the moving walkway at an airport.
Mhm.
The white supremacist is the guy who gets on with the suitcase and starts walking. So he gets to the other side really fast, right? A
Mhm.
normal white person is who's a good person at heart, who doesn't consider themselves a racist, gets on that walkway and doesn't move. They're still going to get to the same place as the white supremacist. It's just going to take them a little more time.
Mhm.
If you want to be actively anti-racist, you have to turn around and start running. You
Mm.
have to make significant changes in your life, in your attitude, in your conversations, and in your teaching that will inspire those conversations in others. And that's what I really hope to do with this book.
Uh, and it's truly phenomenal. One of the biggest pieces for me was the idea that her lawyer, the Ruth Jefferson, who is the African American who is on trial here, her white woman lawyer
Right,
would not touch race in the courtroom because
right.
she kept saying it's not about race, it's about what happened while you were on the job.
Mhm.
And it resonated with me as an educator because as an educator, we're told, whether explicitly or not, don't touch this subject in your classroom. I don't care what your classroom looks like. You're not
Mhm.
going to talk about race because we're going to be treating all students equally and we're going to be colorblind. So I think something that we struggle with,
Yeah,
right? I know it's
yeah,
laughable, but it's so big. And I identified with that so much because
right.
it's like, yeah, my superiors have told me time and time
Mhm.
again, do not broach this subject. But it's so important that we do. So I think so many educators kind of worry about tiptoeing around that. So, how do we approach those kinds of courageous conversations?
Great,
And
perfect.
how can we allow the arts to maybe be a part of that?
Great. So I think that first of all, it's so important to have those conversations. Second of all, colorblind is not a thing. When you say colorblind, what you're really saying is, I am not acknowledging that the fact that your skin is darker than mine has made your life different from mine. Now, none of us really mean that, right? What you
Right.
really mean is we're color aware. So be color aware. In your classrooms, try to find a way to be color aware. So, an example I give all the time when I'm talking about this book is, I say, no matter what your sphere of influence is, use the fact that you are white to bring that discussion to the table. People always want to hear what white people have to say. I don't know why, but they do. And sometimes the best thing you can do is make room at your table so that someone who traditionally hasn't had a voice does get to speak. So, how do we extrapolate that into the field of education? Well, if you're a parent, for example, and you have a second grader in a predominantly white class, go to the teacher and say, "Hi, I'm just wondering, what are you teaching this year about African American history and culture? Is it about slavery and victimization, or maybe are we going to learn about some great heroes, who also happen to be African American? Some inventors, for example. There are people who have invented incredibly important things that we never cover in school.
Yeah.
Lewis Latimer, for example, you use his inventions all the time,
Mhm.
and most people have no idea who he is. So why not start by expanding the curriculum to make sure that whoever we're covering includes people of color and not just African Americans. We're also talking about Latinx people, Native American people, any way that we can, broadening the scope of what we teach. The same goes true in an English classroom. So, for example, what's on your curriculum? What are you reading? How many authors of color are you reading? And is it one for one? One white author to one author of color. If it's not, why not? If we only read the people who look like us, we learn nothing. We have to read the people who look and sound different and have had different experiences than we have. That's how we broaden our minds.
Right.
So make sure that there is a vast stocked library in your classroom, even if it comes off your own personal bookshelf, of people like, Jesmyn Ward and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Angie Thomas is a great new writer for YA who wrote a terrific book called The Hate You Give. There's a book coming out this fall by a woman named Nick Stone called Dear Martin that should be in every single high school classroom. All of these are stories that are real and raw and tell the real truth of what it means to be an African American youth in this country. We need more of that. And we don't need it just for the kids of color in our classroom. We need it for the white kids. We Need Diverse Books is a movement that, of course, happened in the publishing industry about publishing more writers of color and getting these stories out. But it's not just about getting the stories out. It's about getting the white kids in the classroom to understand that that experience is important to you too.
Right.
So again, try among all the requirements that are standards now, try to find a way to integrate that again into the curriculum and to find those ways to not fall into, I'd say, the old habits. Don't read books by just old dead white guys.
Yeah.
Don't just talk about slavery and say we've covered African American history. Find other ways to bring that conversation front and center. And if you can, try to go see a local performance of something like Raisin in the Sun. Talk about how that can be extrapolated to today's world and today's culture. Find the ways that you as a community, as educators, can really poke that discussion with a stick.
Yeah.
It is uncomfortable, and you are going to have parents calling. That's a good thing. And really hope that you have administrators that are so inclusive and are so strong in a culture of acceptance that they can have a message to provide to parents about why this study is important.
Well, I want to make sure that we honor your time. So thank you so much for taking some time out to chat with us today. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for doing the good work you're doing.
Want to hear more from game-changing artists and authors like Jodi? Join us for our semi-annual online Arts Integration and STEAM conference. Our next event is happening soon, so head on over to artsintegrationconference.com to learn more.